Hello, my name is Ryan Bauma. I'm a principal and project manager with AECOM, the planning consultant for the Lee Highway Planning Study, also known as Plan Lee Highway. Arlington County is currently in phase 2 of the study, and in collaboration with the county, we have completed the land use scenario analysis for the neighborhood areas along the corridor. Information about the process, including why we are studying Lee Highway, as well as the corridor-wide and neighborhood area concepts, can be found on the project website. This narrated presentation is an overview of the concepts for Neighborhood Area 3, which includes the Waverly Hills, Donaldson Run, Old Dominion, Glebewood, and Waycroft Woodlawn Civic Associations, as well as Area 4, which includes Cherrydale and Maywood. So our planning begins with a bold vision for the future of Lee Highway, based on the power of people and place by 2050. Where Lee Highway will become a green main street of vibrant neighborhoods that links iconic local businesses, mixed-use activity nodes, sufficient and mixed housing supply, and signature public spaces. Lee Highway will become a place that invites and enables safe and equitable access for all users, including pedestrians, bicyclists, transit riders, and motorists of all ages. We also want to provide a diverse housing supply that enables equitable access for people of all ages and income levels to the housing of their choice. We want to build environmental sustainability and resiliency, manage our stormwater effectively, reduce energy demand in buildings, and promote mass transit and walkability, and achieve carbon neutrality in support of county policies. We're going to promote development that enhances the economic well-being of the corridor through investments, jobs, and larger tax base, and provide community facilities and gathering spaces for all ages and income levels. We're going to feature inspiring architecture and landscapes designed and constructed to last for generations, and to celebrate, honor, and acknowledge the past, present, and future through vibrant public spaces, art, and culture. These images combine to create a picture of what that bold vision can look like. A truly livable built environment that's biophilic and combines all of the different elements that the corridor has today with new amenities and experiences, along with the public facilities and open spaces, art, history, and culture needed. There are 5 major redevelopment areas along the Lee Highway corridor. We're going to be focusing on Area 3 and 4 in this presentation, but it's helpful to see the broader context, where in Area 1 in the west and Area 5 in the east, the redevelopment potential is oriented towards the transit opportunities along the Orange and Silver Line, in East Falls Church and in Courthouse. And then in the middle of the Lee Highway corridor, there are 3 different Main Street areas. Main Street West in Area 2 near the Lee Harrison Shopping Center, and then Main Street Central and Main Street East in Area 3 and 4. This area in the middle of the corridor is where we hope to see the greatest transformation from a highway-oriented landscape and land use to more of a Main Street experience that's highly walkable, connecting mixed-use nodes at major intersections. This transformation will take parts of the streetscape and the public realm that are inhospitable to pedestrians and cyclists today, like the images on the left, and transform them more towards images like you see on the right from Westmoreland Street on the western end of the Lee Highway corridor, where we bring together new residences and new businesses along tree-lined streets, connecting pedestrians and motorists and transit riders and cyclists. So we're now going to zoom in and talk about Area 3 and then Area 4 in greater detail. Through our engagement with neighborhoods in Area 3, a number of key aspirations have come to the surface. First and foremost, the desire for more businesses with greater access to parking, and our mixed use at major intersections and along both sides of Lee Highway and Old Dominion Drive, west of North Woodstock Street. There's also the desire to diversify housing types and increase density in the core areas and residential edges, including new opportunities for independent senior living. The Lee Heights Shops is to continue to be the social hub of activity in this area and be complemented by new indoor and outdoor public gathering spaces and multi-use spaces in private buildings nearby. And regarding the historic and cultural resources in the area, this is something that neighborhoods really wanted to highlight, both the buildings that are historic and the stories and events that happened at those sites nearby. And the culture in the neighborhoods through art and tourism needs to be revealed as well. People want to experience and expand the arts along the highway and the experience there. And the most distinctive attributes in their community by 2050, people want to see its mix of height and scales and architectural forms, and the integrated connection to nature through lush greenery, open spaces, and natural stream valleys. There are a number of characteristics and planning influences in Area 3 that are shaping the way we think about scenarios there going forward. Just to summarize a few of these, from the standpoint of transportation, connectivity, and urban design, portions of Lee Highway here, especially west of Glebe Road, are some of the narrowest in right-of-way. And pedestrians feel unwelcome and vulnerable in many cases, especially crossing the streets and moving along the narrow sidewalks. The way the buildings are set back from the street with parking lots in front deters pedestrian connectivity and reduces walkability. There's very little relationship between the buildings and the street, except when you're at the Lee Heights shops. In other cases, with regard to the environment, the core areas have very low tree canopy and a high percentage of impervious surfaces. This causes downstream runoff challenges as the runoff from rain events goes into the pipe system very quickly, sometimes overloading it. Building heights in the area are low to mid to high-rise buildings and variety in a number of eclectic forms and styles. And then from a development potential standpoint, though, this is part of the corridor that has some of the largest land parcels for future mixed-use redevelopment, as well as potential consolidation, where properties adjacent to each other could be purchased by a third party, or one of those parcels buying another adjacent to it in order to combine them and expand the development envelope. So the inspiration for the design concepts moving forward comes from our neighborhood inspiration report. And through those discussions with the community, it was very clear that the Lee Heights Shopping Center needed to become a stronger social and economic hub for the adjoining communities, and that this revitalized shopping center and surrounding commercial properties with their signature Main Street and plazas will be the main public gathering space for the communities. And this will be ringed by an urban neighborhood with a mix of low, middle, and high-rise buildings, similar to what exists today. And the core area will be surrounded by its historic neighborhoods and will be characterized by the canopy of trees and lush green areas. And these images highlight some of the experiences and scale transitions and heights that would be talked about later on in the presentation. And we're also drawing inspiration from the visioning study ideas for this area. And some of those creative ideas looked at realigning the Old Dominion Drive intersection with Lee Highway so that people could cross more safely than they can today, and new development opportunities could be created. There was also ideas about how to locate new public gathering spaces near the Lee Heights shops and other commercial redevelopment areas. Some of those thoughts would require some significant land acquisition. So we want to adapt that intent into some locations that can be built in partnership with the private sector. And there's also opportunities for that public space to help manage excess runoff and reduce downstream flood impacts. And at the Lee and Glebe intersection, there are a number of larger parcels or potential consolidation of parcels where, again, multiple pieces of property adjoining each other could be purchased together or to create one larger parcel for redevelopment. There are many of those opportunities at that intersection, and it's also possible to create some new mixed-use development there of good density and scale that can also step down and transition to the adjoining existing neighborhoods. So the planning team has prepared a number of scenarios for Area 3. These scenarios are explorations of different ways of meeting Plan Lee Highway goals and the inspiration from the community. They're not intended to be options where you choose one or the other in its entirety. They're an exploration of different approaches. And the idea here is to look to compare them, see which elements of each are most advantageous for the community, and then they will be assembled together in a hybrid idea called the conceptual master plan for the corridor. So the scenarios that are shown here are not the only ideas that can be brought forward, but they can be used to help identify which are the best approaches for redevelopment and providing the amenities necessary in Area 3. We start out with these two different scenarios by sketching in different ideas for how the street network might change, where public spaces may go, and how new buildings and existing buildings could work together in the future. And we're going to talk more about the land use, connectivity, and public space ideas that are embedded in each of these ideas. And we're going to actually talk about them in three distinct areas: west of Glebe Road, between Glebe Road and Lorckham Lane, and east of Lorckham Lane, as each of those locations is a bit different in its context. But overall, the objective for these opportunities is similar, and that's to create mixed-use development along the highway, diversify housing options, establish good transitions to surrounding neighborhoods, enhance Lehigh Highway itself to accommodate wider sidewalks, street trees, and bicycle facilities, to relieve pressure at key intersections that are causing trouble for pedestrians, and reduce curb cuts along Lehigh Highway to eliminate vehicular, pedestrian, and bicycle conflicts. One of the Vision Zero goals of the county. To create additional publicly accessible open space, and to strengthen the Lee Heights shops and the areas around it so that it can continue to be a social hub for the neighborhood. And to provide additional stormwater detention that will augment the underground detention vault that is being considered at Woodstock Park. We'll talk more about what that means shortly. These diagrams describe some of the land use concepts for each of the two scenarios, A and B. First, let's orient ourselves to the legend. The blue color highlights the publicly owned land or public facilities, mainly the Langston Brown Community Center and Fire Station 8. The green highlights the key open space ideas, either existing locations like Stafford Park and Woodstock Park, but also proposed open spaces that might be privately owned but would be publicly accessible. The yellow areas, shown mostly in scenario A, represent locations where the addition of two-family or low-scale multifamily structures could be added in either lot by lot or in a small grouping of lots incrementally over time into those residential edges. Those would provide more transition housing types to add new capacity and new housing options for people in the residential edges, but in ways that are very complementary to the existing single-family homes. The slightly darker yellowy orange color, which is mostly shown east of Woodstock Street, is for moderately scaled multifamily residential. This is what is mostly on the ground there today, and the idea there would be greater infill in between those existing buildings to create new housing capacity at similar scale. The orange areas are actually quite flexible. In these orange areas, the idea would be to allow commercial land uses, meaning new businesses of different types, even office space, or low to moderately scaled multifamily residential, or mixed-use development that combines retail and commercial and residential uses together. And the reason to have that flexibility is so that the corridor can develop organically without having its land uses prescribed in great detail. However, there is an additional overlay with the red stripes, and the idea with that location is that is in each alternative places that we're referring to as having ground floor retail priority, meaning the buildings that are rebuilt along the corridor there in those areas should be built to be retail ready, meaning their first floors are built to accept ground floor retail, either restaurants or storefronts or other activated commercial uses that we'll talk about in a moment. Over time, those uses may not exist day one when those buildings are built, but we do want the buildings built to have the capacity to be retail ready. That means having the right height of that ground floor and the right electrical and utility services so that businesses can come into those ground floors and interact with pedestrians on the street. So looking west of Glebe Road, one of the biggest differences between scenario A and scenario B is the amount of lot consolidation that's anticipated. Again, lot consolidation meaning multiple smaller pieces of property adjacent to each other being purchased from those owners and combined together to facilitate larger development footprints that can provide transitions and other amenities. In scenario A, modest lot consolidation is assumed, with really consolidation happening within the first half a block off of Lee Highway to the north and to the south. In scenario B, larger amounts of lot consolidation are anticipated, where the first full block of development could be consolidated to open up more flexibility and opportunities. In between Glebe Road and Lorcum Lane, the parcels along Lee Highway can either be mixed-use commercial and or multifamily. The traditional mixed use, with commercial on the ground floor and residential above, is more feasible in this area because the parcels are larger, they're easier to access, and they should be encouraged around key intersections, yet required along specific streets or public spaces that define the center of activity for that node. And then along portions of 20th Road, scenario A proposes to convert single-family residential lots into two-family or low-family multifamily areas over time. In scenario B, modestly scaled multifamily is proposed along those edges, a transition between the single-family neighborhood and the mixed-use development to the north. But in each case, there's a strong focus on mixed-use development, creating a diversity of housing opportunities and reinforcing the retail frontage along Lee Highway, connecting from the Langston Center or Glebe Road eastward to the Lee Heights shops. East of Lorcum Lane and Woodstock Street, the land use aspirations are similar, and that both scenarios propose infill development on the multifamily parcels with new moderate scale multifamily residential. There are a few locations near where the Union Grocery is today where mixed use development could take place to serve local communities. And one of the major differences has to be in how the edges are treated, where along 20th Road to the south of Old Lee Highway, there's the opportunity in scenario A to incrementally change the single family homes to two-family or low-scale multifamily. And that's different in scenario B, where it's imagined that there could be more lot consolidation and that those parcels would become moderately scaled multifamily, of course with an appropriate transition in height across the street. It's also important to note that in that retail-ready streetscape, where we're calling the ground floor priority area, ground floor retail priority area, it's not that every single facade needs to have a storefront or a traditional restaurant. It's also quite possible to imagine other types of businesses that are still engaging with the street, visually interesting, and that relate to pedestrians. These can be active facades, even if those businesses are a little bit different. Some of those examples include coffee roasting, where it's not just a coffee shop, but a place where the beans are actually roasted and produced. Or even urban farming ideas like Fresh Impact Farms right there along Lee Highway to the west. They could come up and have an engaging relationship with the streetscape as well, even as they're producing local food. Pet grooming and boarding is emerging as an important use, as well as co-working and even maker spaces where people can gather to pursue hobbies or entrepreneurial activities that involve fabrication and using specialized equipment. These are all neighborhood-oriented, neighborhood-friendly ways of utilizing ground floors in an activated way that can help make that walkable street possible and improve opportunities and amenities for local neighborhoods. It's also important to think about the future of data as we all use more and more data going forward, and our vehicles use more of it in the future. There's going to be a need for decentralized data centers that can also be part of each of these buildings going forward, both as a revenue producing use and something that can help occupy ground floor space. In the area west of Glebe Road, we have an option to consider here where we're looking at redevelopment within the first half block compared to more consolidation that could include the first full block. This is similar to some development that can be found on Route 7 in the city of Falls Church, where on the left-hand image, there's actually a hybrid idea where the redevelopment meets many of Plan Lehighway's goals. In the first half block, there is a bank that still has a drive-through component at the ground floor, but it now has residential above it. This is definitely a step towards Main Street from Highway, but it's a bit of a hybrid. On the right-hand image, just a little farther down West Broad Street, there's an example where the development takes on the first full block and consolidated that property, and what can be built back there has a more continuous streetscape, more ground floor retail, and a higher capacity for residential development above. There's also some publicly accessible open space built into this development. And then it, of course, steps down to the blocks behind. It's also important to note that even if standalone commercial buildings are being built along the corridor, through design standards, their facades and streetscapes can be made more walkable, especially by placing the parking lots to the rear or to the side of those buildings. The next series of diagrams speak to how we might better connect Area 3 and Area 4 in the future. This diagram is like an X-ray of the existing street grid, with the blue lines highlighting where streets exist today, the green lines highlighting where pedestrian corridors exist, and the purple overlay lines highlighting where transit routes follow the existing streets today. This image highlights how some of the connectivity ideas in scenario A for Area 3 can connect to Area 4. Specifically, the biggest difference is where the intersection of Old Dominion Drive comes together with Lee Highway. In scenario A, that's proposed to come through and bend to the south sooner and connect at a 90-degree angle with Lee Highway in order to create a much more Main Street-like intersection that's easier to cross and easier to negotiate for all travel modes. In this case, the idea is that that street could continue southward as part of redevelopment of the adjoining parcels and connect into 20th Road North to provide access to new development and to the existing communities. At the same time, we want to make sure that the area near the Lee Heights shops becomes even more walkable than it does today. And so part of that is slowing the flow of vehicles that move across in front of Lee Heights shops. We'll talk more specifically about how to do that in a few slides. You'll also see farther east that Taylor Street, to the east of Horizon Apartments, is proposed to be extended northwards to connect with Old Dominion Drive, providing another route for vehicles, transit, and pedestrians to connect between those two roads, providing access to new and existing development. And farther east, there are some parallel street grid proposals for Area 4 that we'll talk about in a few minutes. This diagram highlights some of the connectivity proposals within scenario B. In this scenario, Old Dominion Drive follows its current alignment north of Lee Highway, but then connects through directly to 20th Road North. The specific location of this connection can certainly be determined and adjusted in the future along with the input from existing property owners. But that connection also then allows for transit riders to come off of Old Lee Highway and follow an extended 21st Street north to connect to Woodstock Street and the existing transit routes along Old Lee Highway. This has the potential to reduce, again, further traffic burden off of Old Lee Highway in front of the Lee Heights shops and gives greater flexibility for how that street and its amenities are handled in the future. There's also the concept of rerouting Woodstock Street north of Old Lee Highway to connect more directly to Old Dominion Drive via the Upham Street right-of-way, and meaning that Woodstock Street and Lorcom Lane could be disconnected from each other to help make each of those intersections easier to cross, to calm traffic further, and to create more space for effective walkable redevelopment at the point between Lorcom Lane and Old Dominion Drive. Scenario B also imagines many more alley segments being created in parallel to Old Lee Highway to facilitate access to those new multifamily development parcels. We're now going to zoom in a bit and look at specific areas in scenario A and scenario B to better understand how the transportation and connectivity system might change. In scenario A, again, Old Dominion Drive would connect southward to Old Lee Highway and meet at a 90-degree intersection that would be easier to cross for all pedestrians, cyclists, and motorists of different types, and connect through southward to 20th Road North. That intersection would be easier to use than the current section of Albemarle Street south of Lee Highway. It would be better connected into the street grid, and so it could be swapped for that right-of-way to help make development on either side of that new segment of Old Dominion Drive happen in a coherent way. In addition, the segment of Old Lee Highway that currently connects north of the Russell Building at the intersection west of Woodstock Street to Lee Highway would be converted into more of a public space. Right now it is a place for vehicles to come through at relatively high speed. We want to calm that location by making it more of a public space, but still allow buses to come through in a calm way to keep the transit route in scenario A consistent with today. This concept also allows for the segment of Lee Highway, Old Lee Highway, north of the Lee Heights shops to be narrowed slightly and to no longer include 4 lanes with major turning lanes, but to calm it down to 2 lanes, 1 in each direction, plus parallel parking opportunities on either side to access local businesses. It's also important to still allow transit to come through this corridor. Part of what would make this possible is for traffic that is currently moving eastbound on Lee Highway, Route 29, that wants to go north on Lorcom Lane, that those turning lanes would remain on 29 instead of people having to use this segment of Old Lee Highway in front of the shops to make that turn left onto Lorcom Lane. So we'd be simplifying the intersection there, keeping the higher volume traffic on 29 and calming the traffic along Old Lee Highway. In scenario B, Old Dominion Drive would follow a similar alignment to what it follows today north of Old Lee Highway and Lee Highway itself, but then continue through on a new route that connects down to 20th Road. And again, the specific alignment in either of these scenarios is still to be determined and would need to be done in concert with the redevelopment of existing property. In this case, 21st Street North would be extended from Woodrow Street in the east, extending westward 1 block in order to facilitate better access for transit and motorists of all types. These roadways would also serve that new consolidated redevelopment, so there could be less curb cuts on Lee Highway. Scenario B, with the new routing of Old Dominion Drive and 21st Street North, allows transit traffic to follow 21st Street and Woodstock to connect to eastbound Old Lee Highway. What that allows is for the streetscape in front of the Lee Heights shops to the north to become a car-only streetscape and very pedestrianized, with the ability to be closed off at key moments to create a plaza that could host events and continue to be that social hub for the community. In addition, there's the idea of Woodstock Street connecting northward through the Upham Street corridor to Old Dominion Drive, separate from the current intersection with Lorcum Lane. In scenario A and B, east of Lorcum Lane, Taylor Street would be connected northward from where it ends today to connect to Old Dominion Drive, helping to complete the street grid better than it does exist today. Also, east-west connectivity for alleys and new streets near the Horizon Apartments, as well as pedestrian and bicycle greenways, could be connected to facilitate more options for connecting the community, both existing and proposed, to nearby amenities. South of Old Lee Highway, in scenario B, a number of alley connections could be created to help serve existing and proposed development and reduce the number of vehicular trips that need to be on Old Lee Highway, making it easier for pedestrians and cyclists to use that roadway. And west of Glebe Road, there are additional opportunities in scenario B to connect the street grid along 22nd Road, in a few locations through redevelopment of the existing properties by the private sector to help better connect existing neighborhoods to each other without having to go on Lee Highway in order to do it. South of Lee Highway, there's the opportunity to create new alley network that can connect between Culpeper Street and Brandywine and Glebe Road to better facilitate adjoining redevelopment. It's also under consideration to extend Brandywine Street northward to connect with Lee Highway over time in order to connect neighborhoods in Glebewood with new commercial opportunities along Lee Highway in the future. The streetscape of Lee Highway needs to change in order to be more welcoming to pedestrians and accommodating to bicyclists and motorists and transit riders of all types. The idea that is being considered at the moment transforms the streetscape by removing the center median, moving the curbs in slightly, providing 2 lanes of travel in each direction, again to maintain flexibility for all the different modes we need, and then to provide wider space for pedestrians and then separated, protected bicycle lanes on either side, buffered from the streetscape. This would also happen in conjunction with street trees and new pedestrian level lighting. These opportunities could also be built upon to add in addition on-street parking if desired, or flex zones that can provide space for light pickup and drop off of deliveries or ride hailing. It's important to note that where we have very narrow right-of-way along Lee Highway, it will take partnerships with landowners in the private sector to add additional space for pedestrians and cyclists on either side. But that partnership can result in better land value for those adjoining landowners and provide the much needed space to move all types of pedestrians, cyclists, and motorists safely. Along Old Lee Highway, the right-of-way is much narrower, but there are still opportunities to make improvements, including wider sidewalks and street trees. There's less of a need to provide the bicycle lanes along this segment. It's also quite steep. So it's possible that the bicycle lanes won't really work there consistently over time. But there are other ideas for how to incorporate bicycle facilities better into the parallel segment of Old Dominion Drive. And we'll talk about that a bit more in Area 4. In Scenario A, the new public space proposals are focused on the Albemarle Street corridor. This is because there's a great potential to serve future redevelopment in the surrounding mixed-use node, but there's also the opportunity to capture additional stormwater that lands on all of the impervious surfaces surrounding this part of Lee Highway. In this location, that water can be gathered along the Albemarle Street corridor and stored in vaults below the public space and let out at a reduced, slower pace into the stormwater management system. This reduces downstream flood risk currently felt by the Waverly Hills neighborhood. And it can work in conjunction with similar proposals within Woodstock Park to the east. There are, of course, additional public spaces proposed that can connect from east to west through the area east of Lorcom Lane, and also a signature public space west of the Lee Heights shops, where the corridor of Old Lee Highway connects to Route 29. In Scenario B, the public space system is focused closer to Lee Highway, and it's more connective, bringing together the intersection of Old Dominion Drive, eastward across in front of the Lee Heights shops, along the previous Lorcom Lane right-of-way, and connecting eastward through the existing and proposed multifamily neighborhood. There's also an additional linear public space that follows the Albemarle Street and 20th Road corridor. This public space also has the opportunity to connect adjoining neighborhoods as well as store excess stormwater runoff in a series of vaults below grade along 20th Road. The comparison between Scenario A and Scenario B here has to do with the amount of public space. There is more of it shown in Scenario B, but it is more linear, connecting between neighborhoods than the centralized gathering space shown in Scenario A. Both scenarios help more effectively manage stormwater and reduce downstream flood impacts. These images highlight just two examples of public spaces that also help manage stormwater. These show locations where the water is visible at the surface. It's also possible to have that water stored below grade in vaults to allow for a more activated surface condition in those public spaces. We know that building heights are a very important and sensitive issue with the community. And they're an important part of the transition and the evolution of Lee Highway going forward. It's important to note that the recommendations that are being shown are allowances. They're allowances for potential future building heights that could be used as an incentive to work with the private sector to provide public improvements that are important to the community. Today, the different commercial and multifamily zoning allow for heights between 4 and 6 stories, roughly 45 to 60 feet in height. Additional heights for properties along Lee Highway may be needed to accommodate parking and to encourage the improvements along the corridor we need. It's also important to note that there will be additional consideration for historic structures and how they may affect the heights of buildings around them. And it's really important to focus on the idea that the maximum allowable building heights would not be granted automatically. They'd be subject to site plan processes and county board review and approval. Also, to achieve those maximum allowable heights, there would have to be good transitions, both in height and density, between that new development and surrounding neighborhoods. That's very critical. The different ways that we can help manage those transitions can be through increased setbacks, using landscape buffers and trees and open spaces. We can use the alleys and service roads to make those transitions, and we can also taper down our building heights at the appropriate rate. These images highlight just two situations along Columbia Pike where building height transitions are managed in different ways. The top images show where a more modestly scaled multifamily and or mixed use building can transition to an adjoining existing single family neighborhood using an alley behind it and a landscape buffer in both conditions. These may apply to conditions you see in scenario A, west of Glebe Road. The images on the lower part of the slide show conditions where along Lee Highway there can be new public space, more consolidated redevelopment that achieves taller heights with mixed-use development, but then steps down to that full block street to create a transition to single-family homes that uses something that is more like a townhome scale to make that transition along the street. So taller heights closer to Lee Highway where the public spaces are, stepping down to lower heights adjacent to existing communities. That condition is relevant to both scenario A and scenario B in many locations. These diagrams highlight the zones of different allowable building heights in scenario A and scenario B. It is important to note that those maximum allowable heights, again, would only be achieved through an incentive process that results in public improvements. Those public improvements could involve new streetscape enhancements, utility undergrounding, the provision of publicly accessible space, increased amounts of housing affordability, new sustainability benefits and carbon reduction attributes. There are a number of different public benefits and public improvements that could come out of the redevelopment at those maximum heights. But we also want to make sure that those maximum heights can taper down to adjoining neighborhoods appropriately. In scenario A, the heights begin by working their way up from up to 4 stories adjacent to existing neighborhoods, up to 5 stories west of Glebe Road along Lee Highway, and then east of Glebe Road up to 7 stories for most of the area between Glebe Road and Woodstock Street. East of that, where the apartment buildings are already above that building height, the suggestion is to allow up to 10 stories so that new development can happen between those existing buildings at similar scale and allow for that infill and creation of new housing types. So there's an area of up to 10 stories shown in the northeast corner near Stafford Park where those taller buildings exist today. It's important to note that the building heights are organized to make the most of those new open spaces and to help make them possible. In scenario B, where west of Glebe Road, where there is a larger amount of consolidation proposed, the area that is allowable up to 7 stories is expanded, but of course still steps down to the adjoining community down to 5 stories and then to 4. It's important to talk about why are we saying up to 7 stories. The idea there is 7 stories is a threshold where above that you start to change the building type that is necessary. That starts to change the costs of that construction. It changes the area that you need to make it possible, and it changes the way you have to do the parking. So up to 7 stories, you can use a similar building type, and it's a sweet spot for the development community being able to provide great architecture and a combination of affordability and a variety of different public improvements. East of Glebe Road, the alternatives vary as well. In scenario A, up to 7 stories is proposed between Woodstock Street and Glebe Road to facilitate new consolidation of land and to incentivize the types of public improvements that are being discussed. In scenario B, there's a greater height shown along the southern side of Lee Highway, and that's because there's also a greater amount of open space shown and more changes in the street grid that would require more space and more cost. So in scenario B, that's shown at a higher height allowance in order to give those owners flexibility to consolidate their property and to help provide those public improvements. Now, we know this is a sensitive issue with the community. What we're putting forward are ideas for consideration and discussion. Both scenarios can work to provide the improvements that are desirable at different rates, and they can help achieve Plan Lee Highway goals. They're just different ways of approaching it, and they provide the owners of that land with different flexibility in achieving it. East of Lorcum Lane, the two scenarios are relatively consistent, focusing on increased height in the northeast corner, again, where existing buildings of similar height are today and where that infill development is proposed to be at a similar scale. As mentioned earlier, the Lee Heights shops are a very important part of the social life of Lee Highway today, and that is to continue in the future. Important there is the maintenance of legacy businesses and the way people engage with those businesses in the streetscape in front. One of the things to consider is the ways in which new residences could be added near those shops, either above or slightly behind them, in order to provide more residents to patronize the shops there in the future. And the images on the right just highlight a number of ways within the region, either in Arlington or in nearby Washington, D.C., where existing single-level commercial space has been added onto either above it or behind it with taller residential uses or even office uses at times. And there will be an opportunity for you to register your thoughts on what the most important parts about the Lee Heights shops are coming up online. These next two slides highlight a number of key comparison items between scenario A and scenario B based on a variety of factors in land use, connectivity, and public space. So as a quick refresher, you can refer to this slide to better understand how the two alternatives compare to each other. Similarly, this slide compares the two alternative scenarios based on their building height ideas, clustering, aging in place opportunities, and a variety of housing diversity and cultural resources topics. We're now going to pivot to speak more about Area 4 and its aspirations. In Area 4, we're not focused as much on land use related recommendations as the Cherrydale Revitalization Plan already describes the land use and mixed use aspirations for the community. But we are very concerned about how the transportation, public space, and public facilities systems can be realigned to work better and help make that revitalization plan possible. So one of the key aspirations does have to do with implementing that revitalization plan with multi-story, higher density, and mixed-use buildings along Lee Highway, and incentivizing the production of affordable units in exchange for density. There are, of course, different viewpoints on the height of those new buildings and what may be appropriate. There was some support for additional mixed-use development in areas outside of the revitalization district boundary. The public parking off the street as well as on street along the Lee Highway to support existing and new businesses. And there's support for increasing residential density as well, expanding commercial zoning in areas for many of the parcels along Lee Highway. They're quite shallow to support more local businesses in the area. From a public space and transportation and urban design standpoint, there's additional concerns about the 5 Points intersection and how it can be further enhanced to reduce conflicts and improve safety and ease of walkability. and expanding Cherrydale Park and improving accessibility to it, to Lee Highway, and providing the gathering spaces that people have been requesting along the Cherrydale neighborhood. And of course, relative to history and cultural resources, we want to find a way through that public realm to recognize and highlight the historical importance of the area's resources and how the street-carved suburb identity that is Cherrydale and Maywood, how that identity can be adapted for modern living through high-performance transit service, mixed use, and residential densification. There are, of course, a variety of local characteristics and planning influences that shape our ideas here. From a transportation and connectivity standpoint, there's already a lot of good things happening in Cherrydale, with one of the more pedestrian-friendly streetscapes with street trees, wider sidewalks. In many cases, it can be an example for other parts of the corridor. But there are still some challenges in crossing the street and the desire to improve and extend those enhancements farther. There is strong east-west connectivity, and parallel bike routes could be feasible north of Lee Highway if we can connect some of the north-south streets better between those blocks. And that would help reduce the number of vehicles that have to connect with Lee Highway and allow greater opportunities for access to redevelopment parcels and avoid curb cuts along Lee Highway itself. Environmentally, the revitalization district area has a relatively low canopy, tree canopy, and a high percentage of impervious surfaces. There are some challenges down the hill with flood water moving towards the Spout Run watershed that we want to try and augment through our work here. And the building heights are typically low-rise buildings, but up to 5 stories, and getting to that mid-rise range. And the historic commercial buildings and new mixed-use buildings in the revitalization district, they have a great human scale and a desirable urban form. Again, a model for other parts of the corridor. But there are other locations where there is less of that desirable urban form, especially where the car dealerships exist. From a development potential standpoint, there are relatively shallow lots along the way there that we would want to encourage and incentivize consolidation with adjoining properties to help make quality development possible. And we are surrounded by some really wonderful single-family neighborhoods that we want to be sensitive to and make proper transitions in height and density appropriately. So again, the desire and the inspiration for this portion of the corridor is as per the Cherrydale Revitalization Plan, the Cherrydale and Maywood would continue to evolve into a cohesive, vibrant, and walkable mixed-use and commercial area. That the 5-point intersection will be reconfigured and adjusted further in this area to experience a safer street crossing and improve pedestrian and cycle access to Metro and nearby parks and trails. So we're able to go back and look at the ideas generated during the 2016 visioning study, where a few different thoughts about where to create public spaces in keeping with the intent of the revitalization plan, and how possibly to reconfigure the 5 Points intersection to help create some of that public space and improve traffic operations were considered. A number of dramatic ideas, actually, that in concert with redevelopment that we want to learn from and build on. Some of the challenges, though, with these ideas were that some of these ideas really do start to encumber private land and take up quite a bit of what could be developable private sector opportunities. Also, the multimodal circulation through the 5 Points intersection could become circuitous and potentially create challenges for safely moving the current and future volume of pedestrian traffic, cycles, transit, and vehicles through there. So with those potential circuitous roundabouts and traffic circle-like ideas, there could be some unintended consequences that make it harder to move transit vehicles and other things through this location. So we want to be mindful of that as well. So we've been thinking about the segment of Old Dominion Drive heading uphill west of Cherrydale and thinking about how that streetscape can become more calm, still move a variety of different transportation modes safely, but create some more space for pedestrian and cycle experiences. The idea here is to actually remove that small center median and with that space, move the northern curb line farther south, still provide 4 lanes of traffic, 2 in each direction. But that new space that we gather, we can create a new buffer for street trees and pedestrian level lighting, and a shared use path for pedestrians and cyclists going in both directions all along the northern side of the roadway, with just the need for a small additional corridor of space adjacent to the roadway. And that would provide everyone to the west and the east better access to the school and the park space there, and improve bicycle connectivity up what otherwise would be a pretty steep climb on Old Lee Highway, or a potentially dangerous climb without those buffered facilities along Old Dominion Drive. And of course, there's the opportunity to imagine expanding the bus system to include bus and HOV priority at peak times in that outer lane, similar to what's being piloted to the east in Area 5. The idea is to continue that operation at peak times in a managed lane on the edges here in that outer lane to improve transit access and performance. As mentioned earlier, within Cherrydale itself, we already have a model streetscape for walkability in many ways, but there's still some enhancements that can be made. West of North Monroe Street, the median could be removed in order to provide space for a westbound bike lane protected on the northern side of the corridor. That would then allow for the maintenance of the on-street parking, 2 lanes in each direction, and the ability to have dedicated bicycle facilities going in each direction more continuously. And that would, be possible even with just a slight change in the curb line. Of course, there's the opportunity when the waterway gets wider to also imagine adding flex zones and, of course, bringing the enhanced bus service through this corridor as well. This diagram highlights a number of different ideas simultaneously. For one, it highlights key locations for potential public spaces that could be created over time in concert with adjoining private development. It shows where that area of change might be in the light purple, where the prime locations for consolidation of property and redevelopment for mixed-use purposes could be. The red and blue dots each highlight whether that block is inside the revitalization district boundary or whether it is only the commercial sites that are within that district boundary. And there's a highlighted line there in greenish blue for where potential new streets could be created to help better connect the neighborhoods surrounding the main portion of Lee Highway there. Specifically, you can see on the northern side, connecting behind the Safeway, and then along in parallel to Lee Highway, connecting westward across Pollard towards North Quebec Street. There could be a new parallel street that is built as part of consolidation and redevelopment of those properties along Lee Highway. And then there's also the opportunity to extend 20th Road North south of Lee Highway eastward towards North Oakland Street through the Brown's Honda site if it's redeveloped, and connecting through corridors to North Oakland Street. And in each case there, what that allows local bicyclists, pedestrians, and motorists to do is connect between neighborhoods to access that new development without having to go through the 5 Points intersection or be on Lee Highway, giving both new and existing residents more options in how they connect to amenities like public facilities and or amenities like the Safeway. Zooming into the 5 Points intersection itself, the goal here is to make some modest changes that can have a big improvement and to avoid encumbering public property or private property with those public rights of way. So first and foremost, the main area of intervention is in the northeastern corner of Military Road and Route 29 where they come together. Again, with that parallel network of streets being possible through redevelopment of the parcels along Lee Highway, that could reduce the need to bring North Quebec Street out to the 5 Points intersection. So if that segment of North Quebec Street is removed, and the frontage road that parallels Route 29 that connects to it are removed, that public right-of-way can be returned to landowners to be developed, and that would remove one of the points in the intersection, remove some of the decisions that need to be made, and create a more continuous pedestrian streetscape connection there, more walkable. So by removing some of those decision-making points, it simplifies turning movements and the flow of vehicles through the intersection. In addition, there's thoughts about how over time, the corner of the Koons Toyota site could become more of a public space that facilitates easier access for pedestrians moving north-south as well as east-west. And you'll also see a greenway connection that can basically act as an extension of Cherrydale Park, bringing it out to Lee Highway as part of that redevelopment on the northeastern side. Lastly, through the redevelopment of the Browns Honda site overall, that site has the scale to be able to develop and transition well to adjoining communities, but also provide publicly accessible open space adjacent to the Cherrydale Fire Station that can act as a highly civic gathering point that's not too close to the roadways, but still allows for ground floor commercial activity to animate that public space. So as we think about the redevelopment along Lee Highway to help meet the goals of the Cherrydale Revitalization Plan, the planning team's assessment of the transportation and open space improvements, thinking about the ways that implementation might be happening will also be considered. And that could include reevaluating the existing planning guidance for specific areas and the adjacent properties where those improvements are identified. For example, recommendations for an additional 1 story of height may be considered for C2 properties where the new development can establish good transitions, achieve desired community improvements, and support the underlying goals of the revitalization plan. And that would mean a maximum allowable height for a total of 7 stories. Now, that could be determined with input from the community in Area 4, and it would not be granted automatically. That would be something that would be subject to a site plan process and the county board review and approval. But if it does make those transitions happen well, it can be an extra tool to help accelerate the implementation of the creation of these public spaces and new mixed-use development. So as we look forward to implementation in both Area 3 and Area 4, there are going to be a number of trade-offs to consider. So first of all, a certain level of base level development that can be built around private investment and contributions to a site's improvements, and some affordability is the kind of the baseline idea. But then we want to consider additional incentives that could be more height, more density, that could spur additional community improvements from that private investment in key locations. Those kinds of investments could be improving Lee Highway itself, identifying and helping to deliver improved stormwater management and sustainability outcomes, creating publicly accessible open spaces, major intersection improvements, street grid expansion, and greater affordability contributions within each of these projects. Although we would anticipate the county to need to be investing in larger stormwater transportation and infrastructure improvements overall. But to get there, we have to consider different trade-offs. Building height being one of them, where in order to allow economically viable development and the desired public improvements simultaneously, might need a little more height in order to make that possible. In other cases, the extent of change horizontally is the trade-off. Do you just redevelop within the core, or do you also redevelop the single-family edges nearby? At the edge, do you integrate new transitioning housing types incrementally, or do you imagine more redevelopment through consolidation of the property? When we look at complete streets, to make sure that we provide for all of the different safe and convenient and comfortable experiences for all these different modes, it's going to require partnerships to make the right amount of space available to do all of that well. And as we think about our businesses, achieving the goal for redevelopment with mixed use and complementary uses, it could impact and displace temporarily some of the existing auto-oriented businesses. And while adding additional residents can benefit neighborhood serving businesses, it may take a while for that density to fill back in. So after taking in your input and suggestions on these ideas, we will refine them into a concept plan for the corridor, and then we'll be able to come back to you and share with you a variety of data points on that plan that highlights all of the different elements that are generated by it, so that you can compare and contrast that to the existing conditions and help respond and react to that plan in the future. And as we move forward in the next steps of developing that preliminary concept plan, we'll be coordinating with a number of different entities to address key outstanding topics. So for example, from a mobility standpoint, we'll be modeling the transportation benefits and challenges and coordinating further with VDOT. We will be looking at schools and coordinating with APS to evaluate the changes in student enrollment and identify future school models that may be necessary in key locations. We'll be clarifying the preferred concept for public properties and identify future opportunities for public-private partnerships if new facilities are needed. Clarifying future library concepts, just like that Cherrydale Library. Where's the best place to have it? Is it better to bring it closer to Lee Highway? That's going to be the kind of thing that we think about there. And then, of course, identify options for providing core support services on public land. We'll work with DPR to differentiate the use and character of our open spaces within any key proposed open spaces. And then we will evaluate the achievement of the Affordable Housing Master Plan goal of 2,500 units and target the best ways to try and meet that goal and address the related trade-offs going forward. And from a cultural resources standpoint, we'll describe a framework for varying levels of preservation and interpretation along the corridor for those key properties based on the significant stories, people, and events, and the eclectic architecture of Lee Highway going forward. Thank you very much for your attention to this presentation. On the website, you can find out much more about what's going on with Plan Lee Highway and look at the different recommendations and scenarios for other parts of the corridor. Thank you.